let's face it, a lot of work is boring. I don't care how passionate you are about your business, your career, your side project, whatever it is that you do, a decent chunk of the work involved is just boring. It's the work that you put off for days or weeks or even months. It's the work that leads you to procrastinate, but it's also the work that gets you to the next level if you do it. So how can you push through this type of work, this boring work? How can you execute with persistence and focus and self-discipline to get done what needs to be done, regardless of how exciting or unexciting it might be? Well, that's what we're looking at in this video, and I've split it up into 2 chapters. The first is the meta, so how to think about the boring work, how to perhaps change your perspective around it, which I think will be helpful to a lot of you, especially if you struggle with this type of work. The second chapter is the more practical section. I'm going to share with you a 3-step system for grinding through this type of boring work, as well as 4 tools that will enhance your ability to persist and focus and execute. So let's dive in, starting with the meta. One thing that's very obvious, but is worth reminding yourself of and deeply internalizing, is that there's always boring work to be done. Anything worth doing requires that you grind through some amount of boring work. If you're a writer, then sitting down and planning out what you're going to write, getting into the zone while you're working on the first draft, that might be an enjoyable experience. It might not be boring at all. You enter a flow state, you can see yourself making progress, maybe you write some good sentences and paragraphs. It feels pretty good. It's not that hard to do, perhaps, but maybe when it comes to editing, you just get bored out of your mind. And every time you come to the editing stage, you put it off, you procrastinate. You find anything else around you interesting, more interesting than that boring work. Or maybe you're a student who's studying for exams and you find some topics interesting, but others just bore you to death. But you still need to study them. You still need to do that boring work. Or you run a business, in which case you probably run into boredom quite often, whether it's doing cold outreach to new potential customers or organizing finances or other administrative work. There's a lot of boring work to do when you run a business. This is all normal. There is no career path that doesn't involve some amount of boring work. Even if you do what you love, even if you're extremely passionate about what you're doing, it will still often feel like work. The important thing is to recognize that, to learn how to do that boring work and not abandon something and quit as soon as you get to that boring phase. So there is always boring work to be done, but we should avoid making it more boring than it has to be. We should avoid making it more boring than necessary. And to understand how to avoid that, we need to understand how work gets boring. When it comes to doing work, particularly creative work and entrepreneurship, it looks something like a sine wave, up and down. You have peaks and troughs of excitement, interest, passion, drive, and lack thereof. When you start a project, you're often in a state of high motivation. It's exciting. You're thinking of all the possibilities. You find it easy to sit down and do the work. In fact, you almost feel compelled to do so. Anyone can work hard in this state when they're motivated, but that motivation inevitably fades. You start to enter the trough. You're in a state of low motivation. It's no longer exciting. You're starting to doubt whether you should even continue. You find sitting down and doing the work boring and difficult. Now, there can be a number of reasons why you fall into this trough. The first is that you lose sight of your goal. You forget why you're pursuing what you're pursuing. Or perhaps you never had a strong enough reason in the first place. Your vision of the future reward is not clear to you, or you simply haven't been focusing on it and reminding yourself of it. The second reason we slide into this trough is that we stop experiencing the immediate rewards that come from doing the work. For example, one immediate reward that you might experience when sitting down and pushing through work is a flow state. Not always, but with some types of work, you enter into a state where it's enjoyable, you're in the zone, you lose track of time, you come out the other side and you feel great. That doesn't always happen with boring work, but there's another immediate reward, which is the satisfaction you get after overcoming your own base desires to procrastinate and not work and to be lazy, overcoming that, doing the work, doing something productive, and then afterwards getting that, hit of good feels because you did something hard. It's good. It's an immediate reward. Now, we can manipulate delayed and immediate rewards, which is a tool that I'm going to talk about later in the video. Another reason why we fall into this trough is due to framing and the narrative that we set in our minds. If you tell yourself that the work is boring, it will be so. Now, don't get me wrong. Some work is genuinely boring, right? Like today, after this, I have to read a bunch of documents and I have to sign them. That is boring work. There's nothing exciting about that. There's no part of me that looks forward to that. Like, yay, I get to work. Unlike recording this video, which is a task and activity that I quite enjoy. But if I keep telling myself about how boring it is and how much I'm dreading that task and, I've got to read these documents and sign them and that's the last thing I want to do and so on, then it's likely that A, it will be harder for me to actually sit down and start that task. And B, when I'm actually doing that task, if I get to that stage, I'll find it even more boring than it actually is in reality because I've set up this whole frame and perception of how boring it is. Now, what people fail to realize is that you can pull yourself out of this trough and you can reduce the severity of it in the future. Instead of a straight up and down sine wave, you spend more of your time in a state of high motivation and drive, which carries you through a lot of this boring work. Personally, I don't think you can completely remove the negative. I don't think you can remove the boring, difficult work. I think it's impossible. I haven't seen anyone who's managed to do it. I've never managed to do it, but that's okay because I think that's the place where winners are made. See, your ability to grind through boring work is a competitive advantage. Consider two people who start going to the gym wanting to build muscle. We'll call them Josh and Jake. Josh does some quick research online. He finds a 12-week program that's focused on basic lifts, progressive overload, the things that work, and he gets started. Jake does the same thing. So they're both starting at the same point. A few weeks in, the boredom starts to hit them both. Josh realizes, thanks to watching this video, that boredom is part of the process and that it's okay to be bored, and that simply because he's bored, it doesn't mean he's not making progress. That boredom is not an indicator of lack of progress, but if anything, it's an indicator of progress. And so he keeps at it. He continues with the 12-week plan that he's been following. Jake, on the other hand, feels a strong urge to escape this boredom. He craves that excitement and the motivation that he had at the start. And so he wants to find a new approach to working out. He does more research, he finds a different plan, and he restarts. He jumps to the new thing. This is a behavior that he continues to repeat every few weeks when the boredom kicks back in. Who do you think is going to build more muscle in the long run? Obviously Josh, simply because he can tolerate and embrace the boredom better than Jake can. He can do the work even when the work loses its luster. The ability and willingness to embrace and tolerate boredom is an extreme competitive advantage, and you see this time and time again in various domains. The writer who can sit down day after day for 3 to 4 hours and just write for years on end. How many aspiring writers do that for 2 weeks, get bored, and then quit and go to something else that sparks up the excitement and motivation? A lot, over 90%. Probably. The athlete who can put up with the boredom, the rigor of training, even when he doesn't feel like it, even when he hasn't slept well, is going to come out on top, or at least separate himself from average. Anything exceptional requires this type of consistent effort over time. And if you always pursue what's immediately interesting and enjoyable to you, then you'll always be starting and then abandoning projects and initiatives. You crave the surge of excitement that comes from starting something new, and you find it easy to get stuck into the work. But as soon as it starts getting boring, as soon as you start entering into that trough and you have to grind, something new pops up and captures your attention and pulls you away. When you act this way, when you avoid the boring work, you forego the rewards that come from long-term commitment and compounding. Compounding is quite often boring. Investing in an index fund for 20 years is not exciting. It's not exciting at all. It's boring, right? But the compounding effects of it, the results, are life-changing. Working on your business for years on end is quite often boring, even if business is romanticized nowadays. But the compounding effects of building a business can be life-changing. Now, this isn't to say that you should go out and chase boredom. I don't think that's the right strategy. I think there's something to be said about pursuing work that interests you and you're intensely curious about. Paul Graham says this in his article, How to Do Great Work. Great work happens by focusing consistently on something you're genuinely interested in. He also says, interest will drive you to work harder than mere diligence ever could. I think that's great advice. You want to do things that you are interested in and curious about, but that doesn't mean you won't have to tolerate and embrace boring work at some point in the process. Even the most interesting project will require you to do that. The more you can tolerate and work through these boring phases of a project, a business, a goal, the further you separate yourself from those who can't or choose not to. And one of the reasons why this separation occurs is because doing the boring work changes you in a good way. As I think Alex Hormozy once said, the work works on you more than you work on it. It's not just about the material outcome that doing the boring work leads to. It's not just about the product you launch or the book that you write or the race you complete if you're an athlete. It's also about how you transform as a person doing that work, the character that you build by negating your impulses and delaying gratification, not procrastinating, doing the work instead, sitting down, focusing when there's all these other things that are exciting and interesting that could pull you away from it. It's the mental strength you acquire by doing this, the self-discipline that you build. This carries with you throughout life. It's evidence that you can do hard things. It's something you can fall back on as a reminder when you feel like quitting. I distinctly remember a few times early on in business when I had to grind extremely hard on projects. A lot of it was boring work, but it paid off extremely well, not just externally or extrinsically in terms of financial return, but also in terms of the fact that it's deeply embedded in my psyche. And this helps me to this day to quell self-doubt because I can easily point to these experiences and say, I'm capable of this because I've done it before. I can grind through the boring work in front of me and make it through to the other side. I'm capable of that. I've done it before. This is a good thing to remember when you are in the trenches, so to speak. When you're in the thick of it, when you have to grind through the work, when you can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, when you're doubting yourself, when you're doubting whether the goal even makes sense, remind yourself that in that moment, that by choosing to continue, choosing to persist, that you are forging character that cannot be forged in any other way. Okay, so we've looked at the meta. Let's move on to the system, a multifaceted approach to grinding through the important, boring work. We want to start by getting clear on what we're doing and why we're doing the boring work in the first place. If you're not sure why you're doing something, then it's a lot harder to tolerate that boring work because you'll always be asking, well, what's the point? Why am I doing this? I mean, even when you have extremely strong motivation and you are clear and you do have a good reason for doing something, you can still find yourself asking that question. You can still find yourself wondering whether you should go do something else. And so if you don't have that clarity, it's likely that you're going to quit. Now, when I talk about getting clear, I'm not talking about gaining some perfect clarity or perfect plan or perfect idea of what it is that you want to do. If you've watched my recent video on finding your purpose, you'll be aware of a concept I call the purpose fallacy. The idea that if you just somehow come up with perfect clarity or a perfect purpose, then everything will fall into place. And of course, that doesn't happen, at least for the vast majority of us. And so I think for most people, trying to seek that perfect purpose and clarity is a mistake. What I'm talking about is getting clear on a direction and moving in that direction. It doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to feel like your God-given mission. It just needs to provide some positive benefit, enough to pull you through that boring work. Let me give you some context, an example. Last year, at some point near the end of the year, I noticed myself starting to overthink and doubt what I was doing, like with the YouTube channel and everything else. I knew that if I let that thinking continue, then I'd think myself into a cycle of inaction. I would avoid doing the boring work that is sometimes involved with YouTube. So I reoriented myself and I reminded myself of the goal that I had previously set, which was to publish 100 YouTube videos, and then I could choose to make a decision about what to do next. I got clear on this goal again. I reminded myself of why it was important, how it would benefit me both externally and internally, and I got moving again. I started taking action on the work. Now, is making 100 YouTube videos my life's mission? No. Is it the best possible thing I could be doing right now, working on right now? Probably not, but I don't know what that is. So in the absence of that perfect clarity, it's a good option, right? It's a much better option than avoiding the work and procrastinating and getting stuck in stasis. So you need to get clear on something. You need to have a goal and you need to get started. Your goal also needs to be quantifiable and have a clear endpoint. Otherwise, the third step that I'm about to share with you will be hard to stick to. Now, if you want more information on this, go check out the video where I talk about finding your purpose. In that video, I talk not just about the purpose fallacy, which I mentioned, but also the creative action cycle, which is a great way to start finding your way, navigating some paths, and figuring out what it is you should be doing. The second step is to identify the rewards, the payoffs, and remind yourself of them. So a useful tool for persisting through boredom is to hone in on the rewards that you're gaining from doing the work, both the immediate rewards and the delayed rewards. When we're working on projects or goals or whatever, we often think about the delayed rewards that we'll get eventually through achieving what we're trying to achieve, through completing the project. Might be the money we make after we launch a product, or the recognition we might gain from publishing an essay, or the weight we'll lose by exercising and eating well. These delayed rewards, the results of our goal achievement, are good because they help drive us through the boring work. But we can also hone in on the immediate intrinsic rewards. I mentioned this near the start of the video when we looked at falling into the trough. One of the reasons that happens is we stop focusing and stop reminding ourselves of those immediate payoffs. So the immediate intrinsic rewards, it might be the state of flow we get while we're working on a project, the feeling of accomplishment we gain after a 45-minute focused work block, and so on. When you're finding it hard to persist, or you're finding it tempting to quit and go do something else, even though you know that's not the powerful, strong, best version of yourself thing to do, then you can dial up one or both of these things, the rewards, the delayed and the immediate. For example, going back to my goal to get to 100 videos on this channel, I might be hyper aware of the delayed reward. I know that once I get to 100 videos, I'll feel accomplished. Extrinsically, it'll probably have made some more money and get other rewards, heightened status, a bigger audience, hopefully, and so forth. But what if I'm still finding it hard to persist? Well, I can hone in on the immediate intrinsic rewards. I can remind myself of the rewarding feeling that I get when I'm writing a video script. And that feeling is much better than the feeling I get when I avoid working on this goal to get to 100 videos. If I meditate on that, if I remind myself of that intrinsic immediate reward, then I'm more likely to persist. There's actually a study on this showing that a focus on immediate rewards can be even more powerful and more potent for persistence than focusing on delayed rewards. Now, of course, this works the other way too. I might be so focused on the immediate intrinsic rewards and I start to face resistance. I get bored. I start questioning why I'm doing what I'm doing, in which case I can come back and remind myself of the delayed rewards that I identified beforehand, the why, the external, extrinsic reasons behind why I'm doing what I'm doing. So you want to practically remind yourself of the payoffs that you gain by pushing through the boring work, both the external, material things, the immediate rewards, and also, like we looked at before, the not so obvious things like the change in character, the building of self-discipline, and so forth. How you do this is up to you, but I would suggest that you physically write it out on pen and paper, have it on your desk while you're working. If you really want to embed them in your mind, these payoffs, these reasons for why you're doing what you're doing, then write them down every day. This is not something I do, but I do write down my goals every day. like really simple targets every single day in my notebook. And it has a tremendous effect on my, ability to stay focused and avoid distracting tasks or shiny objects and so forth. And the third step, which is going to sound a little bit lame because it's one of those steps where it's like, yeah, well, of course, like Captain Obvious. Anyway, it's to not deviate. Do not deviate. Suppress and ignore the desire to deviate because it will come up. When you are in the midst of a project and you're finding it boring, you won't find, they will hit you. They will hit you from all directions. These exciting projects, these other things you could work on. And when they hit you, they'll sound really good. You'd be like, that's what I should be doing. I should do that instead. And we like to tell ourselves in this situation that these other ideas and goals are better and that we should jump ship to pursue them. Sometimes this is genuinely the case. I talk about this in my video. It's an old video. I might recreate it on signal-driven decision-making. Sometimes the signal that you get is so strong that it makes sense to jump ship and pursue something else. But almost always, especially when you're in a boring phase of a project, almost always, this is a distraction. And what will happen if you pursue the new shiny object is you'll just end up repeating the process. You'll jump to the new thing, you'll feel excited, you'll feel motivated, then you'll enter that trough again, and then you'll find a new shiny object, and you'll just repeat this process, and you won't compound, you won't commit, you won't get the benefits that come from playing the long game. To become someone who grinds through the boring work, you must become someone who doesn't deviate from the path until they have completed what they are doing. You must train yourself to finish things. In step one, you got clear on your goal. You know what it is. You know where you're at in relation to achieving it. Continue on. Remind yourself of the payoff. When you're tempted to deviate, remember that doing so will weaken you. And the character that you want to build comes from staying the course. Remind yourself that the ability to stay the course and to endure through the boring work is a competitive advantage in a world where people hop from idea to idea, project to project, foregoing the benefits that come from commitment and compounding. So get clear and get going. Identify the payoffs and remind yourself of them, and then do not deviate. Okay, so I want to share 4 tools with you, or tactics, for pushing through this boring work. It didn't really make sense for me to add these as steps, so these are kind of like plug and play if you need them. The first tool is to increase the resolution of progress. One reason why it's hard to push through the boring work is because it often can feel hopeless. You've set a goal, but the achievement of that goal seems so far off in the distance, and the work you need to do today doesn't seem to get you any closer. Even if it theoretically is, you can't see that progress. The problem is that you're playing the game at a low resolution. You're viewing progress on the macro scale. Perhaps you've set a goal to gain 10 pounds of muscle and you're 2 weeks in and you're bored and you're struggling. Well, that's because, in part, it takes a long time to gain 10 pounds of muscle, and you might not notice it within 2 weeks. You probably won't notice it in 2 weeks. And if that's the only frame, if that's the only view that you take on your goal, then it's easy to get discouraged, right? Because like you're all the way down here and your goal's all the way up here. There's a huge distance between that. That is a low resolution frame. You need to increase the resolution by breaking the goal down into smaller steps. This is not a novel concept. You're probably thinking, oh yeah, productivity 101. Like, great advice, Sam. Thanks for teaching me something today. I know it's obvious advice, but it is a good reminder. Your overarching goal might be to gain 10 pounds of muscle, but there are markers of progress that you can embrace and celebrate today to keep you interested, to keep you engaged, and to reduce any boredom that you might face. It might be that you break a PR on your bench press. It might be that you've consistently hit your macro targets for a week, or you've gained half a pound. Whatever it is, there are these markers of progress that you can use and look at when you zoom in a little bit. Increasing your resolution, not ignoring the small improvements, it helps you build momentum and it helps you push through this boring work. And the more boring it is, the more you struggle, the more you should increase this resolution and find ways to play the game in a more engaging and interesting way where you can feel yourself progressing on a daily basis. The second tool is to focus on the inputs. Now, this is another way to increase the resolution of progress, but it's specifically focused on what you can control. You might not be able to control whether you hit a new PR at the gym on bench press or whether your new YouTube video you've published gets the views you want it to get. But you can control the inputs. You can control going to the gym and completing 3 sets of bench press, which will hopefully lead you to getting the PR. You can control writing the script for your next video, which adds to volume and increases your chances of a video taking off. Focusing on the inputs doesn't necessarily make the boring work exciting, not much does, but it does pull you out of the land of fear and doubt. It helps you suppress the overthinking brain that wonders why you're not making progress and whether you should quit and do something else. Focusing on the inputs means that you cultivate a love of effort, not just outcome. Now, to use this tool, you want to ask yourself a couple of questions. First, what are the inputs that matter? This is the question. In pursuit of your goal, what is the work that brings you closer to achievement? If you don't know what that is, then you haven't broken your goal down enough. This work can be consistent daily effort, like writing for 60 minutes per day, or making 20 cold calls a day. Or it can be a sequence of specific tasks. Identify what the most important inputs are and don't deceive yourself, because some inputs are effective but uncomfortable, like cold calling. And the temptation is to find other inputs that satisfy your desire to feel busy and to feel like you're getting somewhere, but let you avoid the discomfort required to effectively move forward. The second question to ask is, am I ruthlessly focused on those inputs? Success is not a mathematical equation, but it is useful to think of it as one if it helps you do better work. And this is the point of focusing on the inputs, that you do things that increase your chance of success. If you want to write a book, then every other strategy and tactic is downstream of one input, which is writing the actual words themselves. If your input is to write 1,000 words a day, 2,000 words a day, which most people will not do, then you increase your chance of success significantly and you feel accomplished every day and you build momentum and you find it easier to endure and to persist and to push through the hard, boring work. Now, you want to track this. I do it in a notebook. My first task every single day when I work is to write. I put it on the to-do list. It says write, and I do at least 1 hour. Okay, the third tool is more of a mental sort of tool, and it is what I call robotic action or mechanical action. This is something that I figured out as a teenager when I had to do, chores at home, like wash the dishes and so on. I didn't want to do it, right? Of course. And at some point I realized I can just go through the motions. Like I can just do the physical thing and not even think about it. And it's fine. It doesn't hurt me to do this. There's no reason why I need to find it frustrating. I can just act like a robot, wash, dish, move, wash, What holds us back from doing the boring work is not that the work is boring per se. We can do boring things. It's that we create a bunch of excuses and reasons to not do the boring work. We put it off, we tell ourselves a story, we frame it in a certain way as to why we shouldn't do it, and so on. Mechanical robotic action is just about doing the physical movements, like I just said. It's about sitting down and writing the words, if you're a writer. Even if you're bored out of your mind working on the second draft of your book, literally just make your fingers move on the keyboard. Nothing more, nothing less. It's about editing the video, even after you've spent hours on it. Just moving the mouse, moving the keyboard, making the cuts, adding the footage, just doing the work robotically. When you engage in robotic action, it means that you don't analyze what you're doing. You don't really think about it. You just do it. You don't create a bunch of preconditions before you start doing the work. You just do it. You're not emotional about it. You just do it. You work mechanically. You're not thinking about what you're doing. You're just doing it. You're not anxious about the outcome of the work. You're just staying on task. You might be thinking, Sam, that's so depressing. I don't want to work like a robot. I'm a human. I want to be engaged in my work. I want to feel the emotion. And it's that's fine. Is it depressing? Because what's more depressing to me is using coping mechanisms. I'm not feeling it today, so I'm going to avoid doing what I know I need to do and what I know will make me feel better. And so I'm going to procrastinate instead or do whatever. That weakens your core. It weakens your identity and you know it. It never feels good to avoid what you know you should do. And if robotic action helps you do what you need to do, why is that depressing? To think that your entire life needs to be one constant flow of like pure joy and happiness is naive. Sometimes you just have to do the thing. You have to get done what needs to get done. It doesn't need to be depressing. It's just reality. The funny thing is, it's like every time I use this tool, like I just decide I'm going to sit down and do the work, it never ends up feeling robotic. Like after 5 minutes of focusing on something, you get engaged, you're actually feeling the work, you feel motivated, you feel satisfied, you feel accomplished as you're doing it. And so I think the whole point here with robotic action is that it's a way to get you started. And the final tool is to cut out distractions. One thing I haven't talked about in this video is, the nature of dopamine and focus. And basically, like if you're distracting yourself all day with social media, with other dopaminergic things, then you're going to find it very hard to sit down and do something that doesn't engage you in the same way as those things. And so one thing I would recommend is that you take a ruthless approach to cutting out such distractions if they are an issue for you. They are for me. So what I've done is I don't have Twitter or Instagram on my phone. And I can't download them either because I got my wife to do the content restrictions thing on screen time, and she knows the passcode and I don't. So I can't download those apps. I actually have to go ask her, like, hey, can you put the code in? Because I want to scroll Instagram for like 10 minutes and look at some memes. But I just can't download it. So if you have the ability to do that, like ask a friend or your spouse or whatever, screen time password, can't download apps, can't visit certain websites, that's great. That's like foolproof pretty much. There's no way around that as far as I know. If there's, do not tell me it because I don't want to know. On Mac, I use self-control. So I just block a bunch of websites like Twitter, YouTube, so on and so on. Set the timer 3 to 4 hours, however long I'm focusing for. So yeah, there's a bunch of tools like this. I'm not going to list them all out, but I would just encourage you to be a bit more ruthless about it. The reason I did the screen time thing is because I just couldn't find a good argument against it. I was like, how does having Twitter and Instagram, but specifically Twitter on my phone, X, whatever it's called, how does that benefit me on a day-to-day? Like the negative of that is way, like it completely outsized compared to any positive benefit I get from it. Anyway, that is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below, hit like, subscribe, and I will see you next time.